The next topic is grammatical influences on cognition, and specifically we are going to discuss the subjunctive studies with regard to that. Subjunctive and counterfactual reasoning. Now, what do we mean by subjunctive? Now, subjunctive is basically a verb, or you can say subjunctive mood is something which is based on a wish or hypothetical supposition, as opposed to indictive mood, which is based on facts. For example, when we're talking about subjunctive mood or mood verb, we say something like, she suggests that he speaks English. But when we are using indictive mood, it's more like he speaks in English, which means that it's a fact. Now, counterfactual is also something which refers to a mode of thinking which is opposite to, or which is literally contrary to the fact. And it also talks about a speculation that what might have been or could have been if the events of detail happened differently. For example, I would say something like, if I had worked hard, I would have passed. So now again, you can see that this is something which a statement or a command or a wish which is perhaps contrary to the fact or contrary to the reality. Now, in this particular area, we have A.H. Bloom, who has conducted a lot of research and pointed out the differences between how Chinese and English speakers reason, particularly interested in counterfactual reasoning, which is the ability to reason about an event which is contrary to the fact. So now let's discuss further. Now, the studies that have been conducted in this area, they generally suggest that the English language has the subjunctive mood, whereas Chinese language is quite opposite to that. Now, if you look at the sentence that we have, if John had come earlier, they would have arrived at the movies on time. So in practice, we see that counterfactual thought often supports speculation, and they support speculation as to what could have been happened had some detail or event in the past occurred quite differently. So in this, the sentence, if John had come earlier, they would have arrived at the movies on time. So this is we are talking about the details which could have happened differently had something happened in the past also happened differently. So in English, we have the subjunctive mood, but in contrast, Chinese does not have a specific form such as subjunctive to express counterfactual meaning. Bloom's thesis was that because the Chinese language does not explicitly mark the counterfactual, Chinese speakers would experience greater difficulties with counterfactual reasoning. Now, he presented several anecdotes for conversations with Chinese speakers that appear to basically support this point of view. For instance, when Chinese speakers were asked sentences such as 3, which is, if the Hong Kong government were to pass a law requiring that all citizens born outside of Hong Kong make weekly reports of their activities to the police, how would you react? They refused to answer the question, saying that the government had not passed any such thing. Now, when they were asked to imagine that the government had and then respond, the speakers protested that this manner of thinking was unnatural and un-Chinese or pretty Western. So now let's try to look at the Bloom's hypothesis more closely. Bloom does not argue that Chinese speakers are incapable of reasoning counterfactually. He simply states that such reasoning is more difficult for them. According to Bloom, the English subjunctive signals direct entry into the counterfactual realm. In contrast, the sentences used to express the counterfactual in Chinese are potentially more ambiguous in that They depend on the context in which the utterance is made. Now, look at the sentence 4. Chinese expression of the counterfactual is shown in this sentence. For example, if I'm US President, then I will think before I speak. Note that this sentence can be interpreted as an implication, which is if then, or as a counterfactual. According to Bloom, when hearing this sentence, Chinese speakers must integrate their previous knowledge with the initial premise, that is, I'm the US President, and then negate this premise before relating it to if-then statement. In effect, the reasoning would have to be something like this. For example, if A, then B, which means I know that A is not true, but if it were, then B would be true. This is a complex form of reasoning with several steps. Thus, on the basis of this analysis of Chinese and English, Bloom predicted that Chinese speakers would make more errors in counterfactual reasoning than English speakers. Bloom concludes that the presence or absence of explicit marking of the counterfactual in one's language does influence the facility with which one uses this mode of thought. To conclude, according to Bloom, presence or absence of counterfactual reasoning does affect habitual forms of thought.